Hi Algebra 1. Today we're going to finish our discussion of ways to solve quadratics with Chapter 9.5, which is solving quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. So a quick reminder of where we've been along this journey. We started out by solving by factoring, and we actually used what was called the zero product property. Now, the advantage is, and I'm not going to read this word for word here, but the advantage is that that is a quick and easy and should be your go-to method. The disadvantage is that not all equations are factorable. So if you have something that's not factorable, you're not solving by factoring. Up next, we did graphing. The advantage here would be that you can see those solutions, right? Because you're going to see where the graph crosses the x-axis. The disadvantage is that you don't always have exact solutions. If it crosses between 1 and 2, you might not know exactly where it crosses. So graphing is a great visual, but not a method that we use often to actually solve. Next, we used solving using square roots. This is a super easy method. You get x squared by itself and then you square root both sides. But the disadvantage is that it can't be used for all equations. It can only be used for something in this form, and that doesn't happen all the time. Up next was completing the square. Completing the square is one of my favorites. I just really like the steps to it. Completing the square does work all the time, except, no, it does still work all the time. A has to be 1. Your leading coefficient has to be a 1. If it's not a 1, you have to divide by that number, and that can give you some really interesting looking fractions. So you could still go through with it, but it does make it a little more difficult to do those calculations if you have to divide by an A. So really, completing the square is best done if your leading coefficient is already 1. So that leaves us the quadratic formula that we're going to talk about today. The quadratic formula does work for any and all quadratic equations. There are no stipulations on when it won't work. The only downside here is that it does take a little bit of time because you have to go through a couple of calculations to get it. So let's go ahead and look at the quadratic formula. Now, one thing to point out is that if you're using the quadratic formula, you have to have your quadratic equation in standard form. So standard form being ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. It has to equal 0. You are then going to take the a, b, and c, those coefficients, and you're going to plug them in. You know, a goes in both of those places, b goes in both of those places, and then your c goes there. Okay, and you plug them in to this formula, and then you simplify it. So that's where I was saying, like, it takes just a couple minutes, not even really minutes, but it takes a couple steps to actually simplify. You simplify it down, and then that's your answers. So has to be equal to 0. Your original equation has to be equal to 0. You get a, b, and c, and you plug them in. So let's go through this formula here real quick. We have negative b, which is going to be the opposite of whatever b is. Your plus or minus is how you're going to get your two answers. The square root of b squared minus 4ac, and that's all under the square root. And then you have it all over, this goes all the way, even under that negative b in the front, all over the product of 2 and a. So you plug in your a, b, and c, and you work it out. So let's take a look at that. So looking at our extra practice, the first thing that I would maybe suggest you do is figure out what a, b, and c are. And I like to write them out to begin with. So what is my a, what is my b, what is my c? You can only get these if it's equal to 0. So I'm going to notice, hey, it is equal to 0. It's written in descending order. So I have my a is my coefficient on the x squared, b is the coefficient on x, and c is your constant. So a in this case is going to be 1. B is going to be a negative 10, and C is going to be 16. And signs do matter, so any place you see a minus sign, that's a negative. So let's start filling in our A, B, and C in our formula. So we're going to have x equals negative b, so I put in what my value is for b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. And see, I just plugged in all my numbers. So next I'm going to go through and actually simplify. So I'm going to have x equals, so I start out, I have a negative 10, which is going to become a positive 10, plus or minus the square root. So I like to do this in like 2 steps. First, what's negative 10 squared? It should be positive 100 minus what is 4 times 1 times 16. So that should be 64. So we're going to do minus 64 all over 2. Okay, then I'm going to do another step. So x equals 10 plus or minus, what is 100 minus 64? It's 36 over 2. Then what's the square root of 36? It is 6. All right, so from this step, we're going to look at our 2 cases. And here's our 2 cases. What's 10 plus 6? 16 divided by 2. That makes 8. And what's 10 minus 6? 4 divided by 2. That makes 2. And there's my 2 answers. So here, real quick. Put in your numbers. Do one step of simplifying the radical, do the next step of simplifying the radical, then we actually took the radical, and then we worked out our 2 cases at the end. So I'm not going to have room to work out number 2, but I'm going to go ahead and work out number 3, and then I'll write in the answers for number 2 in case you want to work that one out and check it on your own. Alright, so the first thing you're going to do is find your a, b, and c, and notice that it's equal to 0. So we're going to say that the a is 3 because that's how many x squared you have. B is a negative 1 and c is a negative 2. And then we're going to fill in the quadratic formula. So we're going to have x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Then my suggestion is to really clean this up in just a couple of steps. So the first thing we're going to do, we have a negative, which is a positive. So we have 1 plus or minus the square root. What is negative 1 squared? It's positive 1. And then if we actually look at this, we're going to consider this a negative 4. What's negative 4 times 3? Negative 12. What's negative 12 times negative 2? Positive 24. So you're actually going to write plus 24 over 6. So there's my first step in cleaning it up. Then I'm going to actually add my numbers underneath. So I have the square root of 25 over 6. What is the square root of 25? It is 5. And once you take that square root, stop writing it. All right, and then from here, you're going to do your 2 cases. So what's 1 plus 5? That's 6. Divided by 6? That's 1. And then what is 1 minus 5? Negative 4 divided by 6. That's negative 4/6, which is a negative 2/3. All right, the answers to 2, in case you want to work that one out, the answers to 2 are 2 and negative 4. Okay, so up next, we're going to look at what happens when it's not equal to 0, and then also we need to look at some different cases. So we're going to start with number 4. So notice this row of problems, none of them are equal to 0. So your very first step has to be setting it equal to 0 before you pick out your a, b, and c. So we're going to add the 13 over to the left. So we're going to have x squared plus 6x plus 13 equals 0. Okay, now we're ready for a, b, and c. So a is 1, b is 6, and c is 13. Following that, we're going to plug that into the quadratic formula. So x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. And then as I start simplifying, I have negative 6 plus or minus the square root. This is going to be 36. And then negative 4 times 13, 52 minus 52 over 2. So that's x equals negative 6 plus or minus the square root of negative 16 over 2. So now we need to look at the square root of negative 16. And we've talked about negatives under square root a couple times. Can I take the square root of a negative number? No. So if this happens, you're just going to say no real solutions. This would be the same thing as having a parabola that does not cross the x-axis. Okay. So that's one of the special cases you can have. The other special case that we don't have an example of here is what happens if you end up with the square root of 0. So let's say you had negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 0 over 2. Well, the square root of 0 is 0. Plus or minus 0 is not going to change anything. So that part actually goes away because it's just 0. And you're going to end up with one answer. That one answer is equivalent to having your vertex on the x-axis. And you just have that one answer. It's called a double root. All right, let's do number 6 here. So remember, the first thing is you want to equal to 0. So we're going to subtract 6 from both sides. That's going to give you negative 4x squared plus 8x plus 6 equals 0. So then if you go through and you find your a, b, and c, a is going to be negative 4, b is going to be 8, c is going to be 6. So if we plug those in, you're going to have x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Okay, so then if I start simplifying, negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 64. And then negative 4 times negative 4 is 16. 16 times 6. How about we do 16 times 6, not 16 times 16. So 16 times 6 is 96. So that's a positive 96 because you multiplied the two negatives together over negative 8. So x equals negative 8 plus or minus the square root. And 96 plus 64 is 160 over negative 8. Now, depending on how you're wanting to answer this, that 160 does reduce. Remember, it's under a radical, so you have to find perfect squared numbers that go into it. This is the square root of 16 and the square root of 10, which would give you a negative 8 plus or minus 4 square root of 10 over negative 8. If by chance these three numbers all reduce by the same number, you can reduce them all. So in this case, they all reduce by 4, and in fact, they all reduce by negative 4. So what that looks like, if you take a negative 4 out of all of those, you're actually going to get 4. Nope, you're going to get 2. Right, if I divide it by negative 4, you're going to get 2 plus or minus. So the 4 would actually become a negative 1, but you can leave it as a positive 1 because your plus or minus takes into consideration that negative. Square root of 10 over 2. Now that is your exact answer in radical form. If it wants it in decimal form, in your calculator, you're going to do negative 2 plus the square root of 10. Do the top part, 2 plus the square root of 10 So I'm going to do mine. 2 plus the square root of 10, get that answer, and then say divided by 2. So if I do that, I get 2.58. And then you're going to do 2 minus the square root of 10, and then divide that by 2, and that's going to leave you with a negative 0.58. So you're going to just put both cases in the calculator when you're done. If you want to check number 5, 5's answers are approximately, because these are going to be rounded decimals, 2.5 and negative 0.8. All right, let me know if you have any questions on using the quadratic formula. I'll talk to you later. Bye.